Call them change makers.
Call them rule breakers.
We call them redefiners. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Redefiners. I'm Hoda Tahoon.
And I'm Simon Kingston.
Simon, the term unprecedented gets thrown out a lot and even maybe overused these days, but I think it truly applies to a record number of national elections that are happening around the world this year in 2024. I think we're going to see more than 70 national elections with almost half of the world's population voting on their country's leader, including the European Parliament, the United States, the United Kingdom, India, and a number more. The results of these elections, of course, are going to impact countries and perhaps the world for years to come. And we, of course, know that the elections are also going to impact leaders around the world in every industry.
They certainly will, Hoda. And all of this change, and some of those elections have already happened, and we may come on to talk about that, but they're happening in the midst of extraordinary turbulence in the world caused by other things. We're all aware of the multiple conflicts with which the world is grappling, whether it's in Gaza or in Ukraine, the civil strife that's afflicting Haiti and South Sudan and the Congo. So although the global economy is showing some signs for optimism, there are major economic challenges alongside those political and social ones that countries around the world face. And if we add to that a sort of crisis in globalization, and depending on who you talk to, a divergence in the terms in which leaders across all sectors engage with each other, it's an extraordinary time. And when you throw in top of that the potential but also the challenges created by AI and other new technologies, it's an extraordinary set of challenges for leaders to work on. But fortunately, we have somebody who can shed some light on that, don't we?
We do. Our guest today is José Manuel Barroso, chair of the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and non-executive chair of Goldman Sachs International. Prior to Gavi, José Manuel was the president of the European Commission from 2004 to 2014, where he presided over the largest expansion of the European Union member countries from 15 to 28. He was also a key figure responding to the financial and sovereign debt crisis in the euro area and beyond. And before that, he held leadership roles at the European Commission. He was Prime Minister of Portugal from 2002 to 2004. José Manuel has also previously served in academic roles at the University of Lisbon, the University of Geneva, and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. José Manuel, welcome to Redefiners.
My pleasure to be with you, Hona, and also with Simon.
José, you've been deeply involved both in academics and politics throughout your career. And early in your career, you were a teaching assistant at the universities of Lisbon and Geneva, and a visiting professor at Georgetown University, at Princeton, and the University of Geneva. Can you share some insights with us about your journey from academia to politics and what motivated you to transition into public service?
I was always between academics and politics because, in my country, Portugal, there was a revolution in 1974. I was the first year of the university at that time. And when you are 18 years old and you see a revolution coming and a regime, that authoritarian regime that was lasting for 48 years, crumbling in front of you, of course you are interested by politics because everything can change. And so I graduated in law in Lisbon at university after 5 years, but afterwards I went to Switzerland to specialize in international relations and political science. And afterwards I came back to political positions, but when there was some possibility, for instance, when my party went to the position, that's when I went to Georgetown University as a visiting professor. So I think it's very interesting to see politics at the same time as an activity. It's your own life, but also as a kind of with some distance. You are a political scientist. You try to understand what's going on. You try to see what happens, both inside and outside.
Let's jump right into the current electoral situation then around the world. Hoda mentioned the extraordinary exercise in democracy that we're going to see in the course of 2024. How important is it at a macro level, really, for leaders, this sheer quantity of electoral activity we're going to see.
Yes, it seems it's one of the most important years in terms of number of people that are voting all over the world, if not the absolute record. Some elections are more important than others. Some of them, in fact, we know the results before the elections take place. That happened recently with Russia, for instance, with Mr. Putin. Others we don't know. For instance, the United States. At the moment we are speaking, we have no idea who is going to win. And of course, I think these are the ones who are more impactful. If you ask me what is the election that has more impact globally this year, certainly it will be the election in the United States of America. There are other important elections, India being one of the biggest countries, but there also we have a pretty good idea about what may be the result. And not because it's not a democracy, but because of the trends of the public opinion there. And in Europe, we have the European Parliament elections that are very specific because it's 7 different elections done more or less at the same time and with political families across countries. So it's a transnational election. It's not probable that one election that takes place in 27 different countries can change dramatically because some countries will see the right wing go up, others not so much. So there will be some kind of muddling through, I believe, in European Parliament elections.
And José, as we sort of take a view from, the macro level, there's clearly an appetite for globalization, but at the same time, there's a view that could be decreasing while populism and nationalism are on the rise in many countries around the world. And, it might be even fair to say that democracy itself might be on the ballot in some countries. How do you see that from a democratic norms perspective, and what do you think is most at risk?
The very simple fact that we have all these elections, I think, confirms one very important point. In spite of everything people say, all the criticisms we have against democracy, people try to find the legitimacy of democracy. It's very important for a leader to say he or she was democratically elected. So the reality is that the authoritarian leaders, they don't like to say they are authoritarian leaders. They don't present themselves as a totalitarian or dictators. They want to say they are democratically elected, even if sometimes democracy, it's quite, debatable what kind of democracy they speak about. And democracy has its problems, and we saw some of these problems recently, but the reality is that the prestige of democracy is higher than any other political regime. That's my first point. Now, in terms of globalization, what you said, Hoda, you are completely right. There is today some kind of change in the globalization. There is some form of re-globalization, and this has been, let's say, this trend has been accelerated by some factors, namely the competition between the United States and China, but also the pandemic has aggravated the issue because of some kind of a regionalization of the supply chains. I would say to some extent that regionalization is the new name of globalization. We have seen this in America, in Europe, as China was doing that already before. So there is, in fact, some kind of backlash against some form or some more, let's say, more extreme forms of globalization. And so it's going to be more difficult to navigate this more, let's say, complex world now.
And José, you said something really interesting. You used the word re-globalization and regionalization. What is the impact, do you think, of these two areas when it comes to business leaders and what they're going to be dealing with and thinking through in terms of outcomes in a year like this year with so many elections?
Today, business leaders, they are giving a much higher level of importance to geopolitical risk. For instance, I was in Davos, as I've been for many years going there, and before, we speak about many kinds of operational risk, market risk, reputational risk, all kinds of risk, but geopolitical risk was not top of mind. Now it is top of mind, yes. Because, for instance, if you have a decoupling, like what happened between the United States and Europe on one side and Russia on the other side, after the Ukraine invasion by Russia, if something like that could happen with China, it will be, of course, radical change. because China is one of the biggest economies in the world. So in fact, now the way people are assessing risk in terms of supply chains, also in terms of investment flows, is very different the way they were looking at it, let's say, 2 or 3 years before.
Thinking of that regionalization and staying with your home region, José Manuel, when you were president of the European Commission, you presided over a period of extraordinary growth and expansion in the membership of the European Union. And we're witnessing it now again, famously for Ukraine, but also Moldova and candidate status for Georgia, and the opening indeed of negotiations with Bosnia and Herzegovina. How do you see those prospective additions affecting the current members?
So I consider the enlargement of the European Union a great success, namely in terms of peace and democracy and stability in Europe. Now we are speaking about a different kind of enlargement because, first of all, we have now a war in our continent, not in the European Union territory, but very close in Ukraine. It's one of the biggest countries in Europe, in fact, that has been invaded by the biggest country in the planet from a geographical point of view. It's Russia. And we are saying this country is going to become a member of the European Union. The same we say about Georgia and Moldova, countries where Russia tries to have a big influence. So there is some kind of uncertainty when it's going to happen. We are working for that to happen. For that, of course, these countries have to go through a process of reform, but also it is expected that we'll have at some point peace so that they can join the European Union. Besides that, there were those Balkan countries that were already in the line, and I hope that they will become members of the European Union in the not distant future. From that point of view, Europe will assume an even more representative dimension of all or almost all the European continent, which I believe it will be good for Europe, hopefully also for the rest of the world.
And an obvious question, given the sheer diversity of those countries, is how easily is the European Union going to be able to handle that variety? I mean, how close are we getting to a multi-speed kind of model?
That's an eternal question. But let me tell you anecdotally, when I was invited to be candidate to President of the European Commission, I went to speak with a friend of mine, no longer with us, unfortunately, was Lord Carrington, a British diplomat who was also Secretary General of NATO. And he said, "Oh, my son," he was much older than me, "Oh, my son, we are going President of the Commission. That's an impossible job." But then he added, "At the end, maybe it's not so impossible. You only have 2 problems, France and Britain." To some extent, it was true, because France at that time was resisting some more integrated economy, so resisting economic integration, and Britain, as we saw afterwards with Brexit, was resisting more political integration. Anyhow, so at the end of the day, and that's what I can share with you from my experience, when we were at the table, myself with my colleagues from the 28 countries, the more difficult were 2 or 3. But if France, Germany and the UK, at that time the UK, were agreeing, sooner or later consensus comes. So the idea that by definition being more, it's more difficult, it's a myth. It's not true. And in fact, we have seen that enlargement has not been against deepening. If you look at the votes of the European countries in the United Nations, today we have 27 members. Their vote is more convergent than when we were 12. Because there is a culture of sharing some common features, some common ideas. So I think, of course, it's challenging. It is challenging, but it can be done. Also because of the communality. There is a sense of communality. And the European Union is really unique. I'm no longer in any political capacity, so as I usually say, my level of sincerity is increasing day by day. I'm not here speaking. I'm not speaking on behalf of the European Union. I'm trying to give you intellectually honest assessment. And in fact, I believe that European Union, it's much better than the alternative. The alternative would be a disunion, lack of union. Can you imagine all those 27 countries, some of them very big, important countries, and some of them, with different cultures. So at the end of the day, there is a culture of compromise in the good sense of the word, not the negative sense. So that, of course, there is a trade-off, a constant negotiation, and agreements can be reached. It's challenging, and I know I was presiding every week the meeting of the Commission, where we were at that time 28, myself and 27 members of the Commission. But I think in 10 years we only voted 3 or 4 times, because there was a good preparation, upstream preparation, and we were working in a spirit of consensus. So it's possible. It's challenging, but it's possible.
José Manuel, if we take a moment now to talk about energy and the green transition in the EU and the rest of the world. The EU has been diversifying their energy imports away from Russia to countries like Norway and the United States and others. And along with oil and gas, of course, and other renewable energy sources, the EU has achieved its 20% renewable energy target in 2020 and now aims to have an even higher one by 2030. However, there's a host of elections this year, as we've been talking about on, the podcast today, which potentially threaten the pace of the green energy transition. And there's particular uncertainty in the US and in the EU and other countries where some candidates might even be pushing back or trying to slow down the green transition. From your perspective, what are some of the challenges you see in achieving this across the EU?
You are completely right. There has been a lot of progress in the European Union. In fact, I'm very proud it was my commission back in 2007, 2008 that launched the big 2020 targets, the so-called energy and climate package. And at that time, the European Union was clearly leading globally. At that time, many of our partners were even saying that there was not such a problem as climate change. Now, apparently, things are making a progress. And so we have been leading globally in the Copenhagen conference. At that time, it was not possible. Afterwards, in the Paris Climate Agreement, it was also. But now I think that in Europe and in other parts of the world, there is a backlash. I really believe there is a risk of slowing down the transition for several reasons, namely the pressure in our countries. The financial pressure, the budget, the fiscal space is low, and there are a lot of pressure. So the climate, while we understand, at least most people understand, the need for the transition, and I remain committed to that agenda fully, it's an existential threat to our planet, so we need to do our part. At the same time, the climate transition may have some costs in the short term. And when we had in our countries all the pressure to support Ukraine, to receive refugees, to still the effects of the pandemic, the support that was given from a monetary and fiscal point of view, all this is a lot of money. And so we have seen that it's very important, that point I would like to highlight, to make the transition, but make it in a socially conscious way, sensible way. To give an example, in one country I know well, it is in fact my country, the government came some time ago with a proposal, the previous government, to tax those people who have cars older than 20 years. Of course there was a rebellion. Because the people who have less money are those who are, the people who are richer, they can buy cars every year, but not the other ones. So this is not socially fair. So it's important that we do the transition in a way that we are not putting an excessive burden in the weakest sectors of our society. So to make it a responsible way, at the same time, it is important that everyone does its part. It cannot only be Europe or the United States or China. We need China, for instance, to be part of it. We need India to be part of it. We need globally to be part of it. If not, those who are doing more, they will say that they are being put in a position of competitive disadvantage because we are putting limits in our industry. At the same time, we are importing products coming from areas of the world where the same limits do not apply. So this is very difficult. And I think, we have seen already in some elections recently that some people are saying we should do it on a slower pace. So I will not be surprised to see a bigger backlash against the more ambitious, let's say, transition in terms of the climate change.
And on this point, how do leaders, both in the public sector and the private sector, think about balancing the risk and the reward of these types of energy investments?
Precisely, we need the market to support it. There has been a lot of progress in some areas in the corporate world. I mean, today there is a greater awareness. I would say the most enlightened business leaders in the world, they understand what is at stake. Yes, and so I think it's important, and there has been, by the way, also from a financial point of view, the creation of new instruments, and including ESG policies and so on. So we have seen a lot of progress. But at the same time, we see that politically, in some of our countries, it's becoming more challenging. Because people look at the debate, for instance, in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is one of the most, let's say, advanced countries in the world from a liberal point of view, from the level of education. The party who won the election is, in fact, criticizing the support given to the climate transition because it says we should look more to the poor people. So it's important to understand where we are. And so I think to balance it with more, let's say, a sustained social policies, I believe it's critically important, and also to have a stronger level of multilateral approach. If not, we are going to see in Europe a bigger backlash against climate change, against climate action.
And José Manuel, as a sincere ex-politician, how important is it for politicians to have business leaders who speak up at this moment? How useful to the political will is that?
Simon, as you know, I've been in both worlds. And I can tell you that sometimes I'm really impressed about the way one world does not know the other one. I was in the European Commission when we were dealing with the financial and sovereign debt crisis. I mean, the biggest crisis after 2008. Let's be honest. Most of the leaders, they did not know anything about financial crisis, about markets. We knew something about public finance, yes. But about the way the markets work, most leaders, they don't know. They have not experience. They have no corporate experience at all. But also, if you go to the corporate world, and I've been working also in the corporate world, including in one of the most important financial institutions in the world, also, there is not sufficient know-how about the way the European politics and the politics in general. The European politics is even more difficult to read because it's so complex, 27 countries, different levels. So I think it's very important that we speak more. There is more interaction. And certainly, when you are in politics, there is an effect, and I can speak. I was 12 years in the government of my country and 10 years leading the European Union. So there is a kind of a bubble. We are somehow, there is some distance between us and what I would call the reality. So leaders of the companies, real corporate leaders that can bring the input of what's going on in the economic world, not only the leaders of the companies, I will say trade unions, I mean the economic players globally. And so, but certainly those leaders that have a good understanding of what's going on globally, I think it's extremely important that they give that input, they send that input, and that there is a transparent way of engaging between the corporate world and the political level of decision.
Fascinating. To take another shared challenge that leaders in all sectors face, and that's the one of the use of potentially liberating technologies in social media and AI to spread disinformation and actively to polarize. How important in this year of elections that we've been talking about, do you think that issue of misinformation and its use by state and non-state actors is going to be? And what can leaders do about it?
I mean, yes, it's a very serious challenge. In fact, we don't know yet how to deal with it. Honestly, when we see what's going on in the politics today, part of it, I think, is because of social media, because social media has been aggravating the tensions, polarizing our societies, because there is not the same kind of, let's say, scrutiny that we have in the so-called mainstream media, where, of course, there are more checks and balances also, if I may use the word, for the media. And today, with fake news, we are seeing, it's probably not a coincidence, that we are seeing the polarization, not only in Europe, look at the United States, look at Brazil, look at Asia, what's happening. more extreme positions, and that coincides with a more aggressive, let's say, role for new forms of communication, namely through social media. So what is important from my point of view is that the center-right or the center-left, those who want to avoid extremism, those who are for open societies, I think they should be more active there. At the same time, trying to create new instruments. And I know, for instance, in the European Union now, there are some efforts for some kind of technology literacy, including for young people, to try to give people the tools to understand what's going on. And they have to be more critical about what they see. They should not take for granted just because something was posted that is true. And of course, with some of new developments in technology, sometimes this is very difficult. And it's a real challenge for our democracies. And we know there are some powers, state powers and the non-state powers that are using those networks to spread misinformation. And we have to be, of course, more aware of it and explain the challenges to the global, let's say, public.
And as we look forward and into the future, specifically in Europe, what do you see are the most pressing issues that are facing Europe in the coming years?
There are different challenges, some internal in our different systems, our countries, other global. Globally, of course, it's the situation of war. Now we have a war in Europe. I mean, a war of aggression launched by Russia against Ukraine. And that has ramifications. It's not just a problem for Europe, as some people say, because we see weapons coming from Iran and North Korea to Russia. And we see also how this is polarizing the world, aggravating this possible decoupling. So it's, in fact, a very serious issue. This is an existential threat for us. Another are the internal developments, namely linked with raising concerns about illegal migration and the rise of populist extremist parties. Because by definition in Europe, if we are a supranational, let's say, organization, of course, nationalism is a problem. Some people speak about the demographic winter of Europe. So we need more migrants. At the same time, parts of the population are not ready to accept more migrants, namely when they come from different ethnic or religious background. And this is a very difficult issue, very sensitive issue to manage. And that explains part of the rise of these extremist anti-systemic parties. And which for Europe is, of course, a very important challenge.
And what are the leadership strategies, do you think, that are going to be necessary to address these things that you've outlined?
I think the best thing is to be honest and to be transparent, and to assume and to have the courage to face the issues. And today I'm concerned with the fact that also because of this pressure, leaders tend to postpone the problems and not to face them. We need to be honest about this matter. Sometimes having the courage to say things that are not popular. To win the argument is to have leadership that is rational and reasonable, but at the same time with courage. And sometimes what we see today is that the extremes, to quote a famous Irish poem, the extremes are full of passionate intensity, while the moderates lack conviction. And we need people that are moderate in the good sense of the word. I mean, that have the courage to be radical, radical in the sense we are going to face these problems from a radical point of view with courage. And I think we feel the lack of this today in the political landscape.
And it's always cheering to hear Yeats being quoted. I think there is almost no Redefiners podcast that we have that shouldn't feature W.B. Yeats at some point. And to pick up a point about where, in the absence of courageous leadership in the political sphere, you see the possibility of courageous leadership from others. How far into those sorts of social issues do you think private sector leaders, A, are needed, B, should stray?
That's a very difficult issue because, of course, for business leaders, what is important is, of course, to maximize profit. And that's what they are paid for by their shareholders. And others say, no, we have a global responsibility. I believe both. We need both. I believe if you are a leader of a company, of course, you have to maximize revenue for your shareholders. At the same time, I think we need leaders to assume their social responsibility. Because we are, in fact, in a defining moment of our societies for the reasons we have been discussing, from demographic trends to the climate challenge to war that is going on in some parts of the world, including in Europe. We need to have the courage of those who are in some position of power, be it political power, be it intellectual power, be it corporate power, to have they have the platform to communicate and to share their vision. And I think if they do it with balance and intelligence, of course, I think that their voices will be heard. So yes, it's a matter of ethics of conviction, but also ethics of responsibility. And we have the responsibility towards our community, be it the national community or be it the global community. I think I know that today it's not so fashionable to speak about the global community. It's very abstract. I don't know if you remember that sentence in The Brothers Karamazov of Dostoevsky, when one of the personages says, "My father liked mankind in general, but he hated every person in particular." But when I think about mankind, I think about every man, every woman, every child. And these are concrete people. So if you are in a position of power, if you are a political leader, a prime minister, a president of the republic, or if you are a CEO or a chairman of a very important corporation, or if you are a great, let's say, public intellectual, I think it's part of our job to address in a responsible way these issues and to share your vision, to share your impression about the need to do something for the common good. The common good should remain a priority for people who are in positions of power, including in the corporate world.
It's so inspiring to hear you talk in that way, because you managed to combine, as Yeats would have it, both passionate intensity and conviction. Were there moments which for you came to be defining of how you decided on the use of your talent, your time? Hoda began at the beginning asking you how you'd found your way into public life, but as you've pursued that career in public life, both nationally and internationally, are there one or two of what we call on this podcast redefining moments that spring out for you?
I would say one of the most important for me was, in fact, fighting the financial sovereign debt crisis. I was in the European Commission when we had the famous Lehman Brothers moment, the collapse of that very important institution that was presented as, for some, as the biggest financial crisis, at least since the crisis of the 30s in the 20th century, and the threats to the euro at that time. You remember that at that time, most people were saying that it was unavoidable Greece leaving the euro. Many people predicted the collapse of the euro as a currency, and in fact, we were able to show the resilience of the European Union. Now Greece is a proud member of the euro, and the euro in fact has been enlarging. Now we have more members of the euro as a European currency. That was a very important moment that shows the need for resilience. Today, resilience is a word that is quite fashionable. It was not like that before, but I really believe this is important. The courage of every day, to have the capacity of pursue in a path even if it seems very difficult. And the reality is that we have done it with a lot of, let's say, difficulties, because by definition the European Union is difficult, it's slow in taking decisions, it's fragmented, it's incremental, but at the end of the day we have been able to show that we had sufficient, let's say, the forces of integration were stronger than the forces of disintegration. For me, that was one of the most redefining moments, if you want, of my political experience.
José Manuel, this has been an amazing conversation. But before we let you go, as our listeners know, we like to end every podcast with some rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Oh my God.
No, it's fun. It's fun. We promise.
Okay, let's go.
Okay. Which global leader do you admire most? They can be living or dead.
From those I've met, by far, Nelson Mandela.
Wow. Okay. Out of all of the cities you have visited, which is your favorite?
Lisbon. It's my own city. Okay, but if I have to say another, I was not there because not my native city, I will still say Florence.
Okay, what is one piece of advice you would share with the next generation of leaders?
Never lose your enthusiasm, even when you lose all your illusions.
It's great.
What is one subject you'd like to learn more about?
Botanics.
Wow.
I have a great curiosity for everything, but when I go to the gardens and to the trees, I don't know enough about trees. But okay, I'd like to know more about botanics.
Okay. And since you are from Portugal, will Cristiano Ronaldo score 1,000 goals before he retires?
You will be very close to it.
Okay.
José Manuel, this has been a fascinating conversation, one in which we could have pursued a whole series of other lines of inquiry. But thank you so much for joining us on Redefiners. It's been a really enjoyable discussion.
My pleasure. Thanks to you, Simon, and to Hoda, and also all the team that prepared it.
Thank you so much.
So it was wonderful listening to José Manuel. We covered a huge amount of ground, from the elections of this year to globalization to the threats of misinformation and disinformation. Really remarkable set of observations that he brought us. One on the challenge of dialogue between commercial leaders and political leaders, and the relative ignorance that both still have of the world of the other. Another on the perils of relying too much on regulation when it comes to dealing with misinformation and disinformation problems, and the way in which AI is managed. A need to balance, yes, responsible regulation with a focus on education of both young people and leaders. The sharing that José Manuel did on the tipping point in the Eurozone crisis in 2011, fascinating and insightful. And despite all of the burden, the challenge of such a long career in public life, that energy with which, in our quickfire set of questions, he offered his advice to the next generation of leaders: never lose your enthusiasm, even while you do lose some of your illusions. Lots there, along with that confident prediction about Ronaldo, in a fascinating episode.